Jake Mitchell had always cherished the quiet, simple life that his farm afforded him. Nestled just outside the suburban sprawl, his land stretched far and wide, a picturesque scene of golden fields swaying gently in the breeze, punctuated by the occasional cluck of chickens or the soft bleat of a goat. This farm wasn't just a livelihood, it was a legacy. Generations of Mitchells had worked this land, pouring their sweat and dreams into every inch of soil. Jake took pride in continuing that tradition, rising with the sun each morning to tend to his crops and care for his animals. His farmhouse, a sturdy old building with a red barn standing proud beside it, had stood the test of time. Weathered by countless storms, it remained a testament to resilience and hard work. Life on the farm was predictable in the best way, peaceful, honest, and grounded. Jake's favorite part of the day was sitting on his porch with a steaming cup of coffee, watching the world wake up. The air was crisp, the earth smelled fresh, and the world felt right. That peace, however, was about to be shattered in a way Jake could never have anticipated. It started with a knock on his front door one fine morning. Jake had been savoring his coffee, eyes half closed, enjoying the symphony of birdsong and rustling leaves. He didn't get many visitors, and those who did come by usually knocked with a friendly rhythm. This knock was different, sharp and insistent. Jake opened his eyes, his brows furrowing slightly. Standing on his porch was a woman dressed in an immaculately pressed beige pantsuit, a clipboard clutched tightly to her chest. Her expression was one of forced politeness, her eyes glinting with an unsettling mix of determination and condescension. "Good morning," the woman began, her tone clipped and formal. "You must be Mr. Mitchell. I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Crestwood Estates Homeowners Association. We need to have a word about your property." Jake raised an eyebrow, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Do we now?" he said, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "I wasn't aware my farm was part of Crestwood Estates." Karen's smile was tight, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Technically it isn't," she admitted, "but it's adjacent to our community, and as I'm sure you understand, property values are a delicate matter. We've received multiple complaints about your farm." Jake set his mug down, intrigued. "Complaints?" he repeated. "What kind of complaints?" Karen straightened her shoulders, as if bracing herself for battle. "The barn, for starters," she said, gesturing toward the red structure that had stood on the property for nearly 60 years. "It's quite an eyesore. A more neutral color would blend better with the surrounding community. And then there's the noise, your rooster, for example. Some of our residents have mentioned being woken up before sunrise. It's quite disruptive." Jake studied her for a moment, trying to determine if she was serious. The barn, with its iconic red paint, was a proud symbol of the farm's history. As for the rooster, that was just nature doing what nature did. "Let me get this straight," Jake said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "You want me to change the color of my barn and somehow convince my rooster to sleep in because your residents don't like the sound of the countryside?" Karen's smile never wavered, but a flicker of impatience crossed her face. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand that change can be difficult, but this is really in everyone's best interest. I'd hate for this to become a more complicated issue." Jake crossed his arms, his easygoing demeanor hardening slightly. "Miss Whitmore, I appreciate you stopping by, but my farm isn't part of the HOA. I don't answer to your rules, and as far as I can tell, my land, my barn, and my animals aren't hurting anyone." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll see about that," she said, her voice dropping into a thinly veiled threat. With a sharp turn, she marched back to her SUV and drove away, leaving a trail of dust in her wake. Jake watched her go, shaking his head. He had dealt with stubborn animals before, bulls that refused to move, goats with a mischievous streak. But something told him that Karen Whitmore was going to be a whole different kind of problem. It didn't take long for his instincts to be proven right. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a letter, an official-looking document on HOA letterhead. It was a formal notice demanding that he comply with neighborhood standards. Jake chuckled when he read it. His farm wasn't even within the HOA's jurisdiction, which made the letter little more than an empty threat. He tossed the letter into a drawer and went back to his work, convinced that Karen would soon realize her mistake and move on to more relevant matters. But Karen wasn't the kind of person who admitted defeat easily. When the letters didn't yield the desired results, she escalated. Calls to county officials followed, complaints about supposed code violations, none of which held any legal weight, but all of which were designed to make Jake's life just a little more difficult. Jake tried to brush it off at first. He had work to do, and didn't have time to engage in petty power struggles. But Karen was relentless. Every time he thought she might have given up, she found a new way to needle him. It became clear that she wasn't just going to go away. Sitting on his porch one evening, Jake found himself wondering what Karen's endgame was. She had no legal right to enforce anything on his land, yet she kept pushing. It wasn't about the barn or the rooster. Those were just excuses. No, this was about control. Karen had decided that Jake's farm didn't fit her vision of what the neighborhood should be, and she was determined to bend it to her will. Jake leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as a slow smile spread across his face. He had dealt with his fair share of challenges over the years. Storms that threatened his crops, stubborn machinery that refused to cooperate. But this was something new. A battle of wills. Well, he muttered to himself, taking another sip of coffee. If it's a fight she wants, it's a fight she's gonna get. He didn't know it yet, but the war between Jake Mitchell and Karen Whitmore had just begun. And it was going to be a battle for the ages. The trouble started almost immediately after Karen's first visit. Jake had hoped that once she realized he wasn't under her jurisdiction, she'd lose interest and move on. Unfortunately, Karen Whitmore wasn't the kind of woman who backed down easily. For her, this wasn't just about aesthetics or property values. It was a crusade. She'd found her target, and now she was determined to win at any cost. The first volley in Karen's war came in the form of letters, official-looking notices printed on crisp HOA letterhead. They arrived almost daily, each one more ridiculous than the last. One demanded that Jake repaint his barn in neutral tones to match the Crestwood aesthetic. Another insisted he construct a privacy fence to hide his livestock from view. One even suggested that he find alternative accommodations for his rooster, as its crowing was detrimental to the community's harmony. Jake chuckled as he read through the stack of letters, shaking his head at the absurdity. He knew they held no legal weight. His farm had been there long before Crestwood Estates had ever existed. He wasn't part of the HOA, and Karen had no authority over him. Still, the sheer volume of the letters was impressive. Karen clearly had time on her hands. Far too much time. But the letters were just the beginning. Soon, Karen began filing complaints with various county departments. First, there was a visit from the county health inspector. The man arrived in a county-issued truck, clipboard in hand, and an apologetic look on his face. "Mr. Mitchell," the inspector said, adjusting his hat, "I'm here to follow up on some complaints about health violations on your property." Jake crossed his arms, amused but slightly annoyed. "Health violations? Care to be more specific?" The inspector sighed. "Noise pollution, improper waste disposal, unsanitary animal conditions, you name it. We've got multiple reports." Jake laughed. "Well, you're welcome to take a look around, but you won't find anything out of order." The inspector did a thorough walkthrough, examining the animal pens, the waste management system, and the overall condition of the farm. When he was done, he gave Jake a sheepish grin. "Honestly, this is one of the cleanest farms I've inspected in months," the inspector said. "I'm not sure who's making these complaints, but it's clear they've got an axe to grind." Jake smirked. "Her name's Karen, and she lives in Crestwood Estates." The inspector chuckled. "Figures. Well, you've got nothing to worry about. I'll file my report and clear this up." But even with the inspector's clean bill of health, the complaints kept coming. Zoning officials showed up next, followed by representatives from the county animal welfare department. Each time, Jake met them with the same calm, unbothered attitude. And each time, they left without finding a single issue. Karen wasn't deterred. If anything, the lack of results seemed to fuel her determination. Her next move was to show up at Jake's farm in person, flanked by two other members of the HOA board. Jake was repairing a section of his fence when he saw them approaching, a familiar beige pantsuit leading the charge. "Well, well," Jake said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Back again, Miss Whitmore?" Karen folded her arms, her expression a perfect mix of annoyance and self-righteousness. "Mr. Mitchell," she began, her tone heavy with feigned patience, "we've been more than reasonable. You've ignored our letters and refused to comply with our requests. This is your last chance to cooperate before we escalate matters further." Jake leaned against the fence, his amusement fading. "You can escalate all you want, but like I told you before, my farm isn't part of your HOA. You don't have any authority here." Karen's smile didn't falter, but there was a dangerous gleam in her eye. She handed him a document. As per HOA regulations, any property within visual range of Crestwood Estates must adhere to our community aesthetic guidelines. We've been in contact with county officials, and if your farm is found to be in violation of zoning regulations, you may be subject to fines. Jake took the paper, glanced at it, and then handed it back. Lady, I've lived on this land my whole life. I know every zoning law in the book. You're not going to find a single thing out of order. Karen's patience snapped. You're making this far more difficult than it needs to be. No, Jake said, his voice steady. I think you are. The two board members shifted uncomfortably, clearly regretting their decision to come along. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but Jake cut her off. If you, or anyone from your HOA, sets foot on my land again without my permission, I'll call the sheriff for trespassing. Understood. Karen's expression darkened. She spun on her heel and marched back toward her SUV, her loyal board members scurrying after her. Jake watched them go, shaking his head. He knew she wouldn't give up that easily, but he was ready for whatever came next. And he didn't have to wait long. A few days later, Jake woke up to find an enormous for sale sign planted at the edge of his property. Beneath it, a second sign read, Coming soon, Crestwood Estates expansion. Jake stared at the signs in disbelief. They weren't just absurd, they were illegal. The HOA had no right to advertise his farm as part of their development. Furious, Jake stormed over and ripped the signs out of the ground. Before he could call the sheriff, a familiar SUV pulled up. Karen stepped out, her face painted with that same smug, condescending smile. Good morning, Mr. Mitchell, she said sweetly. I see you've noticed the sign. Jake folded his arms. Care to explain? Karen feigned innocence. There's been a misunderstanding. Some realtors assumed your farm was part of our future development plans. The sign was placed prematurely. Jake stared at her, his eyes narrowing. You're telling me a real estate agency just mistakenly put a sign on my property, without my permission? Karen's smile faltered slightly. Well, there was some enthusiasm about the prospect. You're insane, Jake said, his voice dangerously calm. Take the sign and get out of here. If I see anything like this again, I'll sue the entire HOA for fraud. Karen's eyes flashed with anger, but she knew she was out of her depth. Without another word, she turned and left. Jake watched her drive away, his jaw set. Karen was relentless, but she'd made one fatal mistake. She'd underestimated him. She had declared war, but Jake wasn't about to back down. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The moment Karen left his property after the latest stunt with the for sale sign, Jake knew it was time to stop playing defense and go on the offensive. For too long, he had treated her antics like an annoying fly buzzing around his head, irritating but harmless. Now, it was clear that Karen was willing to go to any lengths to push her agenda. If she wanted a war, Jake was more than happy to oblige. He started by arming himself with information. The next morning, Jake drove into town and paid a visit to the county records office. He spent the better part of the day digging through every document related to his farm: deeds, land use permits, zoning approvals. By the time he was done, he had a thick stack of papers that proved beyond any doubt that his property was perfectly legal and well outside the jurisdiction of the Crestwood Estates HOA. Satisfied, Jake made several copies of the documents and kept them on hand. His next stop was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Tom Caldwell, an old family friend, welcomed him with a warm handshake and a knowing smile. Let me guess, Tom said, leaning back in his chair. Karen Whitmore? Jake chuckled. That obvious, huh? She's been calling us nonstop with complaints about your farm, Tom said. But none of it holds water. I was wondering how long it would take you to come in. Jake laid the documents on Tom's desk. Here's everything you need to show that my farm is in full compliance. If Karen or her people set foot on my land again, I want them charged with trespassing. Tom nodded, flipping through the papers. You've got it, Jake. You let me know the second they cross the line. With his legal defenses secured, Jake decided it was time for a little payback. Not the malicious kind, but enough to send a message that he wasn't going to be bullied. The first step in his plan was a bit of petty revenge. Karen had made a big deal about his rooster's early morning crowing, so Jake decided to embrace it. He bought 3 more roosters and set them up in a pen right near the edge of his property, within legal limits, of course. Every morning at 5 a.m. sharp, the new rooster choir would begin their symphony, their calls echoing all the way into Crestwood Estates. Jake didn't stop there. He remembered Karen's complaint about the barn being an eyesore and decided to improve his property's aesthetic in his own way. He planted an entire row of sunflowers along the property line that bordered Crestwood Estates. They grew tall and bright, creating a cheerful but obstructive wall that completely blocked the view from Karen's backyard. Now, instead of staring at his barn, Karen had a vibrant wall of yellow to admire. Then came Jake's piece de resistance, the farmer's market. He called up his old friend Mason, who ran the local farmer's market, and pitched an idea. How about we host a weekly farm day here? Fresh produce, live music, maybe a petting zoo for the kids. Mason loved the idea. Within a week, they had everything set up. Jake printed flyers and spread the word around town. The first event drew a bigger crowd than he expected. Dozens of families showed up, eager to enjoy the fresh air and local goods. Kids ran around petting the goats and feeding the chickens, while local musicians played country tunes in the background. Mason sold fresh vegetables, while Jake offered homemade jams and fresh eggs. It was a hit. Of course, it didn't take long for Karen to show up, her face twisted in barely concealed fury. "This is completely unacceptable," she shrieked, waving her clipboard like a weapon. "You can't just turn your farm into a public spectacle." Jake grinned. "Oh, but I can," he said, crossing his arms. "You see, I checked the county laws. My property is fully zoned for agricultural events. Everything here is perfectly legal." Karen's eye twitched. "But the noise, the parking, the disruption to the community." Jake gestured to the happy families around him. "All legal. County approved. And look, people love it. I'm even thinking of expanding it into a full farmer's market." Karen opened and closed her mouth, unable to find a suitable response. She looked like she might actually explode. Finally, without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed off. Jake didn't let up. The next weekend, the farm day grew even bigger. Word spread around town, and more vendors showed up to sell their goods. The local newspaper even ran a story about the event, praising Jake for bringing the community together. Meanwhile, Karen could only watch helplessly as her attempts to shut him down backfired spectacularly. But Karen wasn't done yet. Desperate, she resorted to underhanded tactics. Jake started noticing strange cars parked near the road at odd hours, their occupants taking pictures of his property. One afternoon, he caught a man lurking near the fence with a camera. "Hey!" Jake called out, striding toward him. "What do you think you're doing?" The man looked startled but tried to play it cool. "Just checking on a local property dispute." Jake crossed his arms. "Right. Well, this is private property, so unless you've got a warrant, I suggest you leave." The man muttered something under his breath and hurried back to his car. That evening, Jake received another HOA letter, this time citing unsanitary conditions and possible zoning violations. It was obvious that Karen had hired someone to dig up dirt on him. Enough was enough. Jake called his lawyer and had a full cease and desist order drafted. The next day, he marched straight into the HOA board meeting, uninvited. The room went dead silent as he walked to the front and dropped the stack of legal documents onto the table. "You've been harassing me, trespassing on my land, filing false complaints, and now you've got people spying on me," Jake said, his voice calm but deadly serious. "This is a legal notice. If you don't stop immediately, I'll be suing not just the HOA but you personally, Karen, for harassment, defamation, and illegal surveillance." Karen turned pale, her confidence draining away. The rest of the HOA board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly not wanting to go down with her. Richard, the HOA president, cleared his throat. "Karen, maybe it's time we reconsider our approach." For the first time, Karen had no response. Jake smirked, knowing he had won the first major battle. This wasn't the end of the war, but it was a turning point. Karen had pushed too far, and now the tide was starting to turn. He could feel it. Jake walked out of the meeting without looking back, his head held high. It was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he had the upper hand. Karen had underestimated him. Now it was her turn to play defense. The downfall of Karen Whitmore didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, glorious collapse that unraveled piece by piece, each moment more satisfying than the last. For years, Karen had ruled Crestwood Estates with an iron fist, terrifying residents into submission and bending the HOA board to her will. But like all dictatorships, hers was destined to crumble. Once her facade of authority cracked, there was no saving her. It all started with the emergency HOA meeting, which Jake didn't bother attending. He didn't need to. The wheels were already in motion, and he had provided everything the board needed to make their decision. The meeting was packed with homeowners, many of whom had been quietly simmering under Karen's rule for years. For them, this was more than a meeting. It was a reckoning. Richard, the HOA president, stood at the front of the room, his usually calm demeanor laced with frustration. He held up the stack of legal documents Jake had submitted, clearing his throat to address the crowd. "We've received multiple complaints, not about Mr. Mitchell's farm, but about the actions taken by this HOA. Unauthorized use of funds, trespassing, illegal surveillance. The list goes on." Karen sat at the head of the table, her back ramrod straight, her lips pressed into a thin line. "These accusations are baseless," she said, her voice steady despite the growing murmur in the crowd. "Everything I've done has been for the good of this community." Greg, the retired veteran who had provided Jake with the damning emails, stood up from his seat. "Bull," he said bluntly. "You've been using our HOA funds for your personal vendetta. You even tried to push a special assessment to pay for legal action against Jake. That's not for the good of the community. That's for your ego." The room erupted into murmurs of agreement. More homeowners started speaking up, recounting their own stories of Karen's overreach. Fines for minor infractions, arbitrary rules, and her relentless control over every aspect of their lives. Linda, the former board member who had been ousted by Karen years ago, stepped forward with a knowing smirk. "And let's not forget the fake complaints," she said. "We have proof that Karen filed multiple complaints under fake names to pad the numbers and justify her harassment of Jake." Karen's carefully composed mask began to crack. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "I've always acted within my authority." Richard shook his head. "You've overstepped that authority one too many times. We've reviewed the evidence, and it's clear that your actions have put this HOA at serious legal risk. It's time for us to take a vote." Karen's eyes darted around the room, searching for allies. But the faces that once feared her now looked at her with disdain, or worse, pity. For the first time in years, she was truly alone. The vote was unanimous. Karen was officially removed from her position as HOA president. "You can't do this," she hissed, rising from her seat. "This community needs me." Richard folded his arms. "The community needs peace. And frankly, Karen, they've had enough of you." For a moment, Karen looked like she might argue. Then, realizing there was no way out, she grabbed her clipboard and stormed out of the room without another word. It was over. Karen had lost. Jake heard about the vote that same night. Linda sent him a text, "She's out." "It's done." Jake smiled, leaned back in his chair, and poured himself a celebratory drink. He had fought back and won, but the best part was that he hadn't even needed to do it alone. The community had stood up for itself, and Karen's reign had crumbled under the weight of her own arrogance. But the fallout didn't stop there. Within days, Karen's house went up for sale. The rumor mill churned out story after story. Some said she was moving to a new town to start fresh, while others claimed she had been quietly pressured to leave by the very neighbors she once controlled. Whatever the truth, it didn't matter. Karen was gone, and Crestwood Estates could finally breathe again. Without Karen's oppressive rule, the neighborhood transformed almost overnight. Yards that had once been meticulously micromanaged suddenly came alive with personality. Kids rode their bikes freely, no longer afraid of being reported for playing too loudly. Families started hosting backyard barbecues again, and the threat of a passive-aggressive warning letter was a thing of the past. The new HOA leadership even sent Jake a formal letter of apology for the harassment he had endured. He framed it and hung it next to the cease and desist letter he'd received from Karen, a trophy of sorts, a reminder of how far things had come. But Jake wasn't done just yet. A week after Karen left, Jake put up a new sign at the edge of his property, right where her infamous for sale sign had once stood. It read, "Welcome to Mitchell Farms, HOA free since 1923. The sign quickly became a local landmark. People from all over town came by to take pictures next to it, laughing at the cheeky message. Even the local newspaper ran a story about it, dubbing it the final victory in the battle between Jake and Karen. Jake's farm thrived in the months that followed. His weekly farmers market became a major community event, drawing visitors from all over. Families came to buy fresh produce, enjoy live music, and let their kids play with the animals. Even some of the former HOA members became regulars, happily buying eggs and vegetables from the very farm Karen had once tried to destroy. But karma wasn't quite done with Karen yet. A few weeks later, word spread through town that Karen had moved into another HOA-run community in a different town. She had apparently hoped to climb her way back into power, but what she hadn't realized was that the new HOA already had a president, a woman just as power-hungry and petty as Karen herself. Within a month, Karen found herself on the receiving end of everything she had once dished out. She was fined for having her trash cans out an hour too early, reprimanded for her grass being half an inch too high, and reported for parking too close to the curb. Her new HOA president, it seemed, wasn't interested in sharing power. By the time Jake heard the news, Karen's new house was already back on the market. He couldn't help but laugh. It was poetic justice at its finest. As Jake sat on his porch that evening, watching the sun set over his fields, he thought about everything that had happened. He had never asked for a fight, but when it came, he stood his ground and defended what was his. And in the end, he didn't just win, he thrived. The roosters crowed in the distance, their calls echoing across the golden fields. Jake smiled, raised his glass, and toasted to peace, real peace. No more HOA, no more Karen, just the life he had always loved. It felt good to win. With Karen gone, Crestwood Estates was like a neighborhood reborn. The oppressive air that had hung over it for years dissipated almost overnight. Residents began to rediscover the joys of living without constant oversight and endless fines. For the first time in a long while, people felt free. The changes were immediate and obvious. Yards that had once been manicured to sterile perfection burst into life with colorful flower beds and personal touches. Garden gnomes, wind chimes, even a pink flamingo or two. Children who had once tiptoed through the neighborhood, wary of Karen's ever-watchful eyes, now rode their bikes freely, weaving through the streets and laughing without a care. The neighborhood felt human again, and that alone was a victory worth celebrating. Jake, of course, noticed the transformation too. He was no longer treated as the outsider, the stubborn farmer who refused to bow to Karen's rules. Instead, people started waving as they passed by his property, smiling in a way they hadn't before. Some even stopped to chat, curious about his farm and the weekly market he had started. One afternoon, Linda and a group of former HOA board members showed up at his farm with a basket of homemade baked goods. Linda handed him a pecan pie, grinning like a woman who had finally tasted freedom. "We figured we owed you a proper apology," she said, leaning against the porch railing. "After everything you've been through, it's the least we can do." Jake raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "An HOA apologizing? Never thought I'd see the day." Linda chuckled. "Things are a little different now that Karen's gone. We've decided it's time for a fresh start. No more ridiculous rules, no more power trips. Just neighbors trying to live in peace." One of the others, a quiet man named Ted, scratched his head sheepishly. "Honestly, Jake, most of us never had a problem with your farm. We didn't want to end up on Karen's bad side." Jake nodded, understanding. "She had a way of making life hell, didn't she?" Ted laughed. "You have no idea. Or maybe you do." The mood lightened after that. They sat on the porch for a while, swapping stories and sharing a few laughs. For the first time in months, Jake felt the tension leave his shoulders. The battle was over, and peace had returned. But life wasn't just about peace, it was about growth too. With the HOA no longer a threat, Jake turned his focus back to his farm. The farmer's market had been an unexpected success, and he decided to expand it. What had started as a small weekend event quickly grew into a full-scale community gathering. More vendors joined in, offering everything from handmade crafts to fresh honey and baked goods. Local musicians provided live entertainment, turning the market into a lively, family-friendly destination. Word spread fast. People from neighboring towns began driving in to visit the market, eager to experience the charm of Mitchell Farms. Jake took great pride in it, not just because it helped his business, but because it brought the community together in a way Karen had never managed to do. Families spent their Saturdays at the market, chatting with neighbors, enjoying the live music, and stocking up on fresh produce. It became a staple of the town, something people looked forward to each week. Even former HOA members became regulars. Linda showed up every Saturday, always buying a dozen eggs and a jar of Jake's homemade jam. Ted became one of Jake's best customers, picking up fresh vegetables for his wife, who was trying her hand at farm-to-table cooking. It was ironic, really. Karen had tried so hard to destroy Jake's farm, but in the end, it had become the heart of the community. Meanwhile, the rumor mill churned out stories about Karen's misfortunes. Word had it that she had moved to another town and joined a new HOA, hoping to reclaim her former glory. But things hadn't gone as planned. The new neighborhood already had a president, a woman just as controlling and power-hungry as Karen had been. Within weeks, Karen found herself on the receiving end of everything she had once dished out. Reports trickled in about her struggles. She was fined for having her trash cans out an hour early, scolded for her grass being half an inch too high, and reprimanded for parking too close to the curb. Her attempts to gain power were swiftly shut down. It wasn't long before Karen's house went back on the market. Jake couldn't help but smile when he heard the news. Karma, it seemed, had done its job. But Jake wasn't one to dwell on the past. He was too busy building the future. He expanded his farm, adding a greenhouse and a small cafe that served fresh sandwiches, salads, and pastries made from ingredients grown on the property. The cafe became a popular spot for locals and visitors alike, a place where people could relax, enjoy a good meal, and take in the peaceful beauty of the farm. The sign at the edge of his property, "Welcome to Mitchell Farms, HOA free since 1923, became a tourist attraction in its own right. Families posed for pictures next to it, laughing at the message and sharing the story behind it with anyone who would listen. It became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that sometimes the little guy really can win. As the months rolled on, Jake found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. He had never asked for a fight, but when it came, he had stood his ground. And in the end, he hadn't just won the battle. He had built something better than what had existed before. Karen's downfall was more than just a victory for him. It was a victory for everyone who had been suffocated by her need for control. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, Jake sat on his porch with a cup of coffee in hand. The roosters crowed in the distance, their calls mingling with the soft hum of cicadas. The air smelled of fresh earth and blooming flowers, and the world felt right. He glanced at the sign by the property line, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was funny how things worked out. What had started as a nightmare had turned into something wonderful. His farm was thriving, the community was stronger than ever, and the shadow Karen had cast was nothing more than a distant memory. Jake raised his coffee in a silent toast to the future, bright, peaceful, and wonderfully Karen-free. Life, he thought, was finally back to the way it should be. Peaceful. Simple. His.